no one here is necessarily saying that microevolution is false. I think a lot of the times we're begging the question a little bit about microevolution. We've given a lot of evidence about bacteria and all these things, but again, no new systems were created. And I'd like to sort of point out your specific topic example about making bacteria glow green. I know what you're talking about. That's called GFP, or genetic transferring from jellyfish into these bacteria, namely E. coli. However, there's a couple things that didn't happen within that transfer. One, no new biological system was created or emerged. That didn't happen. Well, I'm talking about an entirely new biological system.
Science.
That doesn't happen within GFP. It doesn't happen at all. Secondly, an intelligent agent transferred genetic information. That is not evolution. Evolution is when it's completely something that happens in nature. Okay? Now, another thing I want to point out, I wrote this in my notes here, it might be a little hard for me to read, but it says, emergent properties within the same ontological order are not the same as the emergence of entirely new biological beings.
True.
Okay, what does that mean? Well, when we look at the philosophy of macroevolution, this is my contention, not microevolution, not merely some beings getting a different shaped beak, or people getting taller or having different colored skin. This is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about beings that never existed, never once existed, now exist out of a completely new being.
Impossible.
Whether this takes a long time to do or not is irrelevant. You cannot give what you do not have. That is a metaphysical fact. If you do not possess eyes, you cannot create eyes. It doesn't happen. It's never happened. And the Cambrian explosion is great evidence for this, because we have entirely, fossil records have stabilized and have created this giant stagnant of history where there are these creatures that exist within a time period. Whether you believe the Earth is 500 million years old or 1 billion years old or 6,000 years old, it doesn't matter. We can look at the fossil records and show, okay, this amount of beings exist within this fossil layer, and then all of a sudden, with no relation to the previous generation of things, new life comes from nowhere. That is not evolution. That is the creation. That is creation. That is God creating. Okay? I cannot safely say, through metaphysics and through ontology and teleology, that creatures merely gained rationality, gained being, and were created out of thin air without an intelligent agent. Now, of course, I'm not saying that my opponents deny an intelligent agent. I, of course, know they believe in God. We're all Catholic here, which is the beauty of this kind of debate. However, you beg the question, how can you explain totally new beings? How do you explain them? Yeah, you can make a caveat and say God, but there is no direct evidence to suggest that human beings sort of evolved from gorillas or from monkeys or from whatever species prior to it, simply because God said so. God also said, deliberately in scriptures that he created Adam out of dust. I think I'm going to take that over the word of a scientist. I think I'm most likely going to say that. Even if you want to contend that it's poetry or it's poetic or whatever, I feel like that's an irrelevant point. We're talking about the entire creation of new beings, not microevolution. So when all of my opponents give the idea about, oh, what about bacteria? Oh, what about this fly? Oh, what about this little thing? Again, no new structures were created. And here's an idea. Earlier, the gentleman from New Jersey stated that, a being could create a little bit of a heart, and then a little bit of a heart, and now we have a full heart. That's not how evolution works, nor how scientists would say evolution works. Firstly, you cannot call something a part without the whole. I don't call a tire a car, because a collection of a tire, plus wheels, plus an engine, plus a body make up a car. A heart is not just muscle tissue, and then more muscle tissue was added, and then more muscle tissue was added, and then somehow we came to this incredibly complex system known as the heart. That's ridiculous. The heart is an incredibly complex system. It pumps blood. The eye, in many species, is an incredibly complex system. It doesn't just emerge from nothing. Okay? God had to create it, and beings that do not possess it cannot transfer it. That's impossible. And that's just metaphysically true. Thank you.
I thank the honourable honourable leader of opposition and call upon the Prime Minister to deliver the final speech of the round, not to exceed 5 minutes, reminding him that while new examples are welcome, new arguments are not.
My opponent said that the Cambrian explosion
created beings, and then afterwards human beings came into reality. Did God create twice then? Wouldn't we had to have evolved from the Cambrian explosion into human beings? I don't know if that's what you're saying. And then the second argument, they said that greater beings cannot come out of lesser beings.
True.
All men are born from women.
This house stands resolved. Evolution is true. Each man in favor raised his hand saying yay.
Yay.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Is that it? No. Yes. All right. Each man against raised his hand saying nay. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All right. Each coward abstaining raise his hand if he dare. 1, 2.
I wasn't here for most of the day.
All right. With 6 votes for the government, 7 votes for opposition, and 2 abstentions, the motion fails. Stand. Christus vincit, Christus regnat, Christus, Christus imperat, Christus vincit, Christus regnat, Christus, Christus imperat, Christus vincit, Christus regnat, Christus, Christus imperat. This house is adjourned.
No.
Now you can make your announcement.
Oh, yeah. Announcement.
Alright. We believe science is real. Women's rights are human rights. Black lives matter. No person is illegal. Diversities are strength. And kindness is everything. The Vatican I dogmatic constitution, De Filius, states the following. But although faith is above reason, nevertheless between faith and reason, no distinction can ever exist, since the same God who reveals mysteries and infuses faith has bestowed on the human soul of the light of reason. Moreover, God cannot deny himself, nor ever contradict truth with truth. But a vain appearance of such a contradiction arises chiefly from this, that either the dogmas of faith have not been understood and interpreted according to the mind of the Church, or deceitful opinions are considered as the determinations of reason. As Catholics, we are called to believe in the truth, regardless of any subjective inability to understand it within our worldview. The opposition would like to propose a world in which the Genesis creation story is entirely literal, and that God formed Adam out of clay and breathed his spirit into his body, using the physical mouth which we know God does not possess. However, as Catholics, we understand the interpretation of Scripture is not up to individual believers, but the magisterium of the Catholic Church. Cardinal Ratzinger said the following: "The clay became man at the moment in which a being, for the first time, was capable of forming, however dimly, the thought of God. The first thou that, however stammeringly, was said by the human lips to God, marks the moment in which the Spirit arose in the world." Pope John Paul II said the following about evolution.
Based.
Before offering a few more specific reflections on the theme of the origin of life and evolution, I would remind you that the magisterium of the Church has already made some pronouncements on these matters. Within her proper sphere of competence, I will cite 2 such interventions here. In the encyclical Humani Generis by my predecessor Pius XII, has already affirmed that there is no conflict between evolution and the doctrine of the faith regarding man and his vocation, provided that we do not lose sight of certain fixed points. It is important to set proper limits to the understanding of Scripture, excluding any unseasonable interpretations, which would make it something which it is not intended to mean. In order to mark out the limits of their own proper fields, theologians and those working on the exegesis of the Scripture need to be well informed regarding the results of the latest scientific research. Taking into account the scientific research of the era, and also the proper requirements of theology, the encyclical Humani Generis treated the doctrine of evolutionism as a serious hypothesis worthy of investigation and serious study, dressed up as I. In order for my opponent to hold a literal interpretation, he would have to cast doubt upon the following scientific knowledge: the Cambrian explosion, dinosaurs, that fish turned into mammals, whales have warm blood because they were formerly land-dwelling mammals, that we have the remains of the Australopithecus, our earliest hominoid ancestor, that Neanderthals lived and can be found in the DNA record of Europeans.
Blasphemy.
The reliability of the fossil record and the long-term development of immune systems and diseases. What's up? The opposition, as far as I understand it, is going to emphasize the uniqueness of the human being, which I do not deny. I do not hold to atheistic explanations of evolution. I affirm that God is the real author of life in the universe, and that man is made in the image of God, and that Adam is the first human being and the father of all. As Dominican friar Walter Farrell put it, men mistake the mystery of the perfection of providence for the impossibilities of contradiction, if they insist on limiting God's mind by the measure of their own. We must take these things as they are, use them, minister to them, for our constructive capacity does not go beyond the world of the artificial, houses, barns, clocks, and cloaks. We do not make trees or cats or sunrises, because these things are beyond our planning. We absurdly conclude that they are beyond all planning, that they have no mind behind their orderly existence. And I will end with a quote from St. Augustine on usually, even a non-Christian knows something about the earth, the heavens, and the other elements of this world, about the motion and orbit of the stars, and so forth. And this knowledge he holds to as being certain for reason and experience. Now it is a disgraceful and dangerous thing for an infidel to hear a Christian, presumably giving the meaning of Holy Scripture, talking nonsense on these topics. And we should take all means to prevent such an embarrassing situation in which people show up vast ignorance in a Christian and laugh it to scorn. The shame is not so much that an ignorant individual is derided, but that people outside the household of the faith think our sacred writers held such opinions, and to the great loss of those for whose salvation we toil, the writers of our Scripture are criticized and rejected as unlearned men. Thank you.
We'll see how it goes. I don't know how to use this.
That's fine. I'll let you know when you have a minute left.
Yeah, just yell at me. Okay. All right. So I'll go ahead and start a little bit here. The first thing I want to point out is that the motion specifically says whether or not, it's not whether or not Catholics may believe in evolution. We're not talking about the permissibility of the question. It's whether or not the question is true. Okay, whether evolution holds, whether it's even remotely viable. Okay. So first, my opponent will likely use church documents, just like he'll start by saying that Catholics are permitted to believe certain things, or they're allowed to hurt certain things, because it might hurt our image if people think we're crazy because we don't believe in evolution, necessarily speaking. But I don't think that's necessarily important, nor does it really matter what atheists say about the faith. Okay, I'm just going to say it plainly. That's kind of silly to me. The church, of course, never dogmatically defined Darwinian evolution, and for good reason. I'm going to start with a few things. First, we begin with science, whatever that even means. I like to point out this very obvious thing that everyone's probably heard of, the Cambrian explosion. Of course, the Cambrian explosion, some people might call it pseudoscience, some people might call it crazy, but I don't think it is crazy, especially when particular scientific experts have pointed out that it has relevance within the modern world. The Cambrian explosion presents a relatively sudden appearance of most major animal body plants, complex organisms that emerge after a long period of time, seemingly out of nowhere. We can't explain where these animals came from, we can't explain how they were designed, or what possibly, so to speak, evolved from. So let's go to my next page, because I don't really have a lot to say. First things first. Second, the origin of life remains incredibly unexplained. Evolution explains the variation of existing life. However, it does not explain how life began. And I'm not going to defend all forms or say all forms of evolution are totally untrue. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying macroevolution specifically is untrue. Microevolution is most certainly true. You can see this within just human beings. People are different heights, people are different colors, and all sorts of other reasons. Birds have different shaped beaks based on their species. But that doesn't necessarily mean the essence or the origin of life came from some unknown species or all one center species. Third, natural selection, or natural select, it does not create fundamentally new biological information. The origin of novel genetic materials or new regulatory networks, like new body plans or whatnot, remain incredibly debated today. For example, when we look at genetic, I forget the specific term off the top of my head, but there is, as things mutate, as things change, genetic material doesn't enhance or improve or get better. That has never been the case, especially in diseases, especially within new body organ systems and things like that. For example, if something never had it, it's practically impossible for it to evolve it new. So there are creatures that have no eyes, and they will never develop eyes. It's just impossible. That's never been witnessed or sort of just explained in science ever before, and it's not likely going to happen. Evolution can describe an increasing brain complexity, but it cannot explain subject awareness, rational abstraction, or moral obligation. So, how do creatures develop morality? Well, many atheists and macro evolutionists will say that morality sort of was an evolutionary existence that helped us sort of continue our species and keep us alive. But that doesn't make any sense. That doesn't seem to make sense at all. And you may not deny sort of the religious aspects, like, well, God created everything, and so God instilled morals into us. But did he create Adam and Eve as mere retarded apes who didn't have moral capabilities, who couldn't do anything, and then implanted a soul into them so they were already creatures? Evolutionists would like you to say that, yeah, these apes that developed rationality, they developed the rationality because of a miracle that merely happened. But that doesn't explain the origin of life, because we don't have any evidence to suggest that human beings develop rationality from apes. This doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We're talking about it in a completely different species. And it's only if you agree with sort of scientific consensus on the matter, but I like to contend with scientific consensus, especially when you look at certain things like the Cambrian explosion. Human beings grasp essential universal truths, things like mathematics, justice, the moral law. These are not physical objects. We cannot see them, yet we know they're there. Okay? If our intellect is merely a byproduct of survival-driven mutations, why trust it when it makes a metaphysical claim like evolution is true? Why trust it? I mean, if it's just an evolutionary, biological, a circumstance, how do I know that I'm living the most perfect human life now? Aren't I sort of evolved in a good way? How do I know that? I would say that that's kind of ridiculous. So I'm going to go into the philosophy of evolution primarily, because I think that's where my argument might have the most water. Evolution is, quote, a scientific model that describes patterns of biological change, but the motion before us asks whether evolution is true. That's the motion, in the sense of being as a sufficient explanation for life's diversity. So is evolution a sufficient claim for life's diversity? And I'll say this. To affirm this fully, one must accept that 1, complex biological systems arose from blind processes. 2, consciousness, rational beings emerged from matter alone. That's what you have to believe if you believe evolution is true. 3, moral obligation evolved from survival advantages. You have to believe that as well if you believe macroevolution is true. 4,
1 minute.
teleology is a total illusion. That's what I'm going to say. All right. The Catholic tradition, so this articulated most by St. Thomas Aquinas, holds that beings possess real natures, real forms, and intrinsic teleology. The Church allows for this investigation of evolutionary mechanisms, but the Church also insists that the human soul is directly created by God, human dignity is irreducible, and providence governs nature. If at any point a merely material animal became a rational person, something immaterial entered that picture. That transition cannot be explained by mutation or natural selection. That is impossible. And if you believe macroevolution is true, then you have to explain how human beings came from irrational beings, like monkeys, and became rational beings. You have to somehow explain that. And I don't believe that there's enough scientific evidence to suggest so. Thank you.
monkeys. That's not true. How do you feel
I agree.
about that?
I agree, it's not true. Yeah, thanks, I win.
That's not an answer to the question. How do you feel about that?
How do I feel that people didn't come from monkeys? I feel pretty good.
Were you there? Were you there with that?
I feel like that's an irrelevant point. I wasn't there when Adam and Eve were created, yet I know it's true. So what are you talking
How
about?
do you know that's true?
Divine scripture, God said so.
Isn't that, you don't think that's poetry? That's poetry?
You think that you think all of Genesis is just poetry?
That's a bad faith argument. I think,
Wait, it's a bad faith argument. I think it's a bad faith argument for you to suggest to me that I can't believe wholly that scripture is true and literal. In fact, I'm allowed to believe that. The church says I'm allowed to believe that. I'm allowed to believe that evolution is not true based on the story of Adam and Eve.
you read that in Zoo before?
Yeah, I read that in Zoo. Yes, I've read that.
Are you aware of Sacrosanctum Concilium? It says you can't believe in folklore anymore.
Oh, so are you saying that Genesis 1 is folklore now?
No, that's not related.
Then how are you talking about? What's
Heresy.
folklore?
That was
Are we
unrelated.
having a real debate?
Why do modern whales have pelvic bones?
Probably because God think they need pelvic bones to swim. I don't know. They might help them. I'm not a whale. Don't ask me that question.
Why do humans have the tailbone?
I mean, I've never had a tail. Never seen a human with a tail. I think we call it a tailbone merely because it mirrors that of other animals that have tails. But I don't think it necessarily means it comes from a tail.
What is a Neanderthal?
A Neanderthal? I don't know. Never met one. Never met a
Are you
Neanderthal.
aware that they're in the DNA record?
Okay, it might be. That doesn't mean that are you saying Neanderthals are irrational beings? Are they not human?
They're not human.
That's not true. We know Neanderthals developed tools and had.
They're
communication
hominoids.
systems.
They're not. Homo sapiens are different species from
Right, but they're still human.
the gorillas.
1 minute.
No, but they're not Neanderthals. Monkeys
What
are
about
Neanderthals.
our Homo erectus humans?
I don't know. I don't know much about Homo erectus. But I got yeah, I really got me there. He told me that Genesis 1's folklore. And
Do you
I
believe in
got
the fossil record?
Yes, I believe in some of the fossil
What
records.
is a dinosaur?
Well, well, I believe dinosaurs and humans didn't live together. I don't believe that. I'm not a younger creationist.
But what is
A dinosaur could be a reptile. Could be a yeah, I think it's a reptile, type of reptile. This is a dinosaur. There were a lot of
Do you
them.
think that dinosaurs lived alongside animals?
I believe dinosaurs lived alongside other animals. Yeah, like other dinosaurs.
Dinosaurs aren't animals, that's a category error.
No, it's not.
Time.
What?
I think the leader of opposition now call upon the prime minister to interrogate the leader of opposition for a period not to exceed 3 minutes.
Okay, I'm allowed to interrogate him.
We can talk after.
Okay.
Time starts now.
Okay, am I interrogating?
Yes, the House Speaker is allowing the member of opposition to be interrogated in lieu of the Prime Minister, yes.
Okay, so I'm interrogating him.
Correct. The member of opposition. Correction.
All right. Well, I want to first start with rational claims of evolution, because I'm not denying that microevolution is necessarily true, but I would like to point out sort of the metaphysical claims that are imported within philosophy and within things like that. How do you explain to somebody that we develop reason when we know through the story of Genesis, through creation, that Adam was created out of dust, and that man was created and imbued with reason from the moment of his creation? How can we explain that man came from another ape, an irrational being, and then somehow became rational?
I think there's not necessarily a metaphysical difference between the two concepts. And that to believe that God created Adam out of nothing, or to believe that he created Adam out of dust, is not necessarily a logical stretch from just saying that God created him from an animal. I would agree with you that the human soul is not evolved into existence, but that does not necessarily mean that God created the man to be a being that couldn't, from pre-existing parts. Whether those parts were a living animal or immaterial things.
Well, why would it be necessary for someone to hold a belief that God created these necessary parts and not just created human right from the start? Why would he have to have then created these necessary parts but then develop a human later? Why would he do that?
I think that's just a question in regards to creation in and of itself, and that why did God have to create things in 7 days either? That's talking about practical mechanics behind something
Right,
that's
okay.
not necessary.
But I would like to point out, when we look at both creation accounts, Adam is created specifically, and I think that if God, I mean, I don't really know, I wasn't there, that's partly true, and none of us were really there. But the idea is that
1 minute.
But I think that God necessarily created Adam specifically apart from gorillas and other apes and evolved. But I'm talking about macroevolution as a whole, because we look at sort of these complex systems coming from other
A speaker
animals.
from Fort Worth will be reminded that it's for questions, not statements.
Yes, I'm getting to a
Yeah.
question. So when we get to this idea, okay, firstly, how then do we account for other things of creation, or the creation narrative, and also just other stories of the Bible, like the Great Flood and things like that? How do we account for these missing fossil records and the Cambrian explosion? How do we account for those?
I don't have a lot of time
Based.
to reply, but I would say that is relying on a purely an interpretation of scripture that has its roots in modernity.
Do you think there's a higher, do you think there's a higher or better interpretation of Scripture and a lesser interpretation of Scripture?
I think that depends on the individual and is kind of.
Do you think it's important that we rely on tradition and the things that have been handed down to us as a means to interpret tradition, rather than come with more modern things merely because we're privy to science?
I think we're getting a little bit off topic.
I thank the Prime Minister and and Leader of Opposition, and call upon the members of government to give a speech. The member of government to give a speech not to exceed 5 minutes in length.
Well, you said that humans came from monkeys. That's not true. How do you feel
I agree.
about that?
I agree, it's not true. Yeah, thanks, I win.
That's not an answer to the question. How do you feel about that?
How do I feel that people didn't come from monkeys? I feel pretty good.
Were you there? Were you there with that?
I feel like that's an irrelevant point. I wasn't there when Adam and Eve were created, yet I know it's true. So what are you talking
How
about?
do you know that's true?
Divine scripture, God says so.
Isn't that, you don't think that's poetry? That's poetry?
You think all of Genesis is just poetry?
That's a bad faith argument. I think,
Wait, it's a bad faith argument. I think it's a bad faith argument for you to suggest to me that I can't believe wholly that scripture is true and literal. In fact, I'm allowed to believe that. The church says I'm allowed to believe that. I'm allowed to believe that evolution is not true based on the story of Adam and Eve.
you read Vatican II before?
Yeah, I read
That's
Vatican
about
II.
the question.
Yes, I've read that.
Are you aware of Sacrosanctum Concilium? It says it can't believe in folklore anymore.
Oh, so are you saying that Genesis 1 is folklore now?
No, that's not related.
Then how are you talking about? What's
Heresy.
folklore?
That was the
Are we having a real debate?
Why do modern whales have pelvic bones?
Probably because God think they need pelvic bones to swim. I don't know. They might help them. I'm not a whale. Don't ask me that question.
Why do humans have the tailbone?
I mean, I've never had a tail, never seen a human with a tail. I think we call it a tailbone merely because it mirrors that of other animals that have tails, but I don't think it necessarily means it comes from a tail.
What is a Neanderthal?
A Neanderthal? I don't know, never met one. Never met a
Are you
Neanderthal.
aware that they're in the DNA record?
Okay, they might be, that doesn't mean that are you saying Neanderthals are irrational beings? Are they
Yes.
not human?
They're not human.
That's not true. We know Neanderthals developed tools and had
They're
communication
hominoids.
systems.
They're not Homo sapiens are a different species from the
Right, but they're still human.
gorillas.
1 minute.
Are monkeys
No, but they're not Neanderthals.
humans?
Monkeys
What
are
about
Neanderthals.
our Homo erectus humans?
I don't know. I don't know much about Homo erectus. But I
Do
yeah, really got me there. He told me that Genesis 1's folklore. And
you
I
believe in the
got
fossil record?
yes, I believe in some of the fossil
What
records.
is a dinosaur?
Well, I believe dinosaurs and humans didn't live together. I don't believe that. I'm not a younger creationist.
But what is
A dinosaur could be a reptile. Could be a I think it's a reptile, type of reptile. This is a dinosaur. They were all alive.
Do you think that dinosaurs lived alongside animals?
I believe dinosaurs lived alongside other animals. Yeah, like other dinosaurs.
The dinosaurs aren't animals, that's a category error.
No, it's not.
Time.
What?
I thank the Leader of Opposition. Now call upon the Prime Minister to interrogate the Leader of Opposition for a period not to exceed 3 minutes.
Okay, I'm allowed to interrogate him.
So we can talk after.
Okay.
Time starts now.
They switched guys.
Okay, am I interrogating?
Yes, the House Speaker is allowing the member of opposition to be interrogated in lieu of the Prime Minister. Yes.
Okay, so I'm interrogating him.
Correct. The member of opposition. Correction.
All right. Well, I want to first start with rational claims of evolution, because I'm not denying that microevolution is necessarily true, but I would like to point out sort of the metaphysical claims that are reported within philosophy and within things like that. How do you explain to somebody that we develop reason when we know through the story of Genesis, through creation, that Adam was created out of dust, and that man was created and imbued with reason from the moment of his creation? How can we explain that man came from another ape, an irrational being, and then somehow became rational?
I think there's not necessarily a metaphysical difference between the two concepts. And that to believe that God created Adam out of nothing, or to believe that he created Adam out of like dust, is not necessarily a logical stretch from just saying that God created him from an animal. I would agree with you that the human soul is not evolved into existence, but that does not necessarily mean that God created the man to be a being that couldn't, like, from pre-existing parts. Whether those parts were a living animal or like immaterial things.
Well, why would it be necessary for someone to hold a belief that God created these necessary parts and not just created human right from the start? Why would he have to have then created these necessary parts but then develop a human later? Why would he do that?
I think that's just a question in regards to creation in and of itself, and that why did God have to create things in 7 days either? That's talking about practical mechanics behind something.
Right, okay. But I would like to point out, when we look at both creation accounts, Adam is created specifically, and I think that if God, I don't really know, I wasn't there. That's partly true, and none of us were really there. But the idea is that
1 minute.
But I think that God necessarily created Adam specifically apart from gorillas and other apes and evolved. But I'm talking about macroevolution as a whole, because we look at sort of these complex systems coming from other
Speaker
animals.
from Fort Worth will be reminded that it's for questions, not statements.
Yes, I'm getting to a question. So when we get to this idea, okay, firstly, how then do we account for other things of creation or the creation narrative, and also just other stories of the Bible, like the Great Flood and things like that? How do we account for these missing fossil records and the Cambrian explosion? How do we account for those?
I don't have a lot of time to reply, but I would say that is relying on a purely an interpretation of Scripture that has its roots in modernity.
Do you think there's a higher or better interpretation of Scripture and a lesser interpretation of Scripture?
I think that depends on the individual, and it's kind of.
Do you think it's important that we rely on tradition and the things that have been handed down to us as a means to interpret tradition, rather than come with more modern things simply merely because we're privy to science?
I think we're getting a little bit off topic.
I thank the Prime Minister and Leader of Opposition, and call upon the members of government to give a speech. The member of government to give a speech not to exceed 5 minutes in length.
And there's a specific one point that I feel like needs to be addressed, is that my opponent seems to argue that purely from a paleontological aspect of evolution, when in fact we have evidence that stretches beyond what can be seen historically. On the first point, whales in the modern day, if you take a whale apart at its backside, it has certain bones such as a hip and part of the femur that cannot be found, has completely no practical purpose in the modern day. And I don't think God would create a being with parts that literally have no purpose at all. And on top of that, we can also see this not just in the animal, but in the created human person. For instance, human beings at the very tip of their spine have a bone known as the coccyx.
Say what?
This bone in every other primate is used to support the tail. However, in human beings, it has no purpose. Secondly, human beings have parts of their bodies that aren't used anymore. For example, the appendix, the wisdom teeth, the third eyelid. and like muscles in the ears, which if humans had not evolved from a previous ancestor, they serve no purpose. Which is against the idea of the body imaging the glory of God and that it has no purpose. This isn't like a disease, this isn't a privation, this is built into the makeup of the human being. And furthermore, to add to my opponent's point that there's a qualitative difference between God creating human beings from the animal versus God creating human beings from nothing. Any said qualitative point relies upon the idea that animals are, like creating a human being from an animal is less dignified than creating a human being from nothing. If that makes sense. Finally, I would also like to point out that evolution as a whole isn't merely the only explanation for human regeneration, if that makes sense. Like, to believe in evolution doesn't necessarily mean like the will evolved, as my opponent claims, that the reason evolved, that the immortal soul evolved, but rather is the main processes, physical or biological, in which we can demonstrate how species diverge over time. To claim that evolution is the system by which the human being was evolved into is taking God out of the picture, number one. But number two, it's consuming that evolution and the human soul are incompatible in the first place. It's a circular argument, if that makes sense. Lastly, I would like to conclude with the fact that evolution does not necessarily have to be based on survival of the fittest, if that makes sense. In that it's based on the animal that is the ability to procreate in the most efficient manner, not necessarily based off of the destruction of other species.
I thank the member of government and call upon the member of opposition to give a speech not to exceed 5 minutes.
All right, my dear gentlemen and gentle monkeys. Or some of you might not say this. How do you like being called an ape? Do you like acknowledging that a part of you is of a lesser status than what you actually are?
That's what it's in.
Would you agree that when Adam's created, that he is perfect in such a case? Would it be correct to say that a human being, which God says, which David proclaims, God created us little lower than the angels, crowned us with glory and honor, would it be right and fitting for a human being to be with the parts of a lesser being? I would argue absolutely not. I think this, what makes men men and animals is entirely two entirely separate entities. We have what we call the hylomorphic view, where the human person is a body and soul composite, and that one cannot be separated from the other except at death, and that's where and that unity is what makes a human. You cannot put a human soul into a cat and now claim that is a human, nor could you put a cat mind into a human body and claim that that is a human. Neither one of those would be a human being. A human being is reliant on both the body and the soul. Okay, so now let's, in Genesis we have no less than 8 times mentions of created beings producing seed according to their kind. The trees, they're made with life-bearing seeds according to their kind. This is no less than 8 times in Genesis. And in Ecclesiastes, it says, "He that lived forever created all things together." These all things must have occurred in their own separate species and identity. They did not necessarily have to come from one from the other. And I think we can even go back to in the time period this would have taken to occur. We already went over the creationist debate last session or 2 sessions ago. What wasn't mentioned is that in Genesis 1:5 it says, "And he called the light day and the darkness night, and then there was evening and morning one day." How else would you like to describe a day? Morning, evening. How else are we supposed to describe that? Give Moses the benefit of the doubt there. I don't think we can describe faith in any other form or fashion. Even in science, we have like the law of entropy, the second law of thermodynamics. The total entropy, disorder, or randomness of an isolated system always increases over time and remains constant in ideal, reversible cases. It dictates that natural processes are irreversible and tend toward maximum disorder, moving energy from a concentrated state to a dispersed state. Hence, we cannot get from a lesser being to a more and more complicated being in the natural state.
Real. True.
Okay.
Truths.
This whole evolution thing comes from Heraclitus. This is pre-Aristotle. Since Aristotle and Plato and the rest of them have already shown him to be incorrect. There are no individual beings, but only, his argument is that there's no individual beings, but only a process of continual change. Okay? Living beings are just piles of atoms that change into something else.
1 minute.
He would argue. But because there's no fundamental unity to the individuals, there's no unum per se. Nothing that exists as a complete substance on its own. As a result of this error, evolutionists will believe that one living species can morph into another, which implies that there's no true identity among the individual members of the species. So this becomes a classification error. And then we have Adam. If Adam comes from the body of something else, then we would have to say that he was immaculately conceived, and there's only one being, I would argue, who was immaculately conceived, Our Lady. And then we also have, let's see.
10 seconds.
I'll just conclude with that. Evolution must not and cannot show, throughout all of history, there's never been a single instance or evidence for evolution occurring within the human species from animal to human. Thank you.
I thank the member of opposition. This House will now be open first to questions, then to comments. Questions. Gentleman from Cleveland.
The evolution side. Regarding the status of Adam and Eve as the progenitors of the human race, if we are to believe that they were, in their evolutionary history, they were monkeys once, or apes, however you may say, and then eventually they evolved to be the first humans, what along that point, when were they instilled with their souls? So when would they be created by God as is mandated to believe the whole highest wealth of humanity?
Stand.
Get off on the opposition. Yeah. Really bad.
One kind of answer to that is that we have to believe, as Catholics, theologically speaking, that the soul didn't evolve. It had to have been imbued perfect in a single moment.
True.
But in that regard, to say that there's a historical basis for that is true, but it's not something that we can obviously track with the archaeological or paleontological patterns.
I guess,
You can say that for comment period.
I'm just saying he didn't really answer. I'm confused.
You could ask another question, yes.
If I wasn't clear in my things, when were the souls of Adam and Eve imbued? Within the evolutionary history, when did they stop becoming monkeys? Outside of the Genesis, like, at what point did they become man and not monkey?
When they were conceived. Most probably when they were conceived. But that is not something necessarily that we could, logically, say, oh, this is a monkey, this is a person, because you can't believe that, like we said, the soul evolves.
Thank you.
That is more of a...
The House recognizes the gentleman from suburbia Chicago.
Do you think that a less perfect being could give birth to a more perfect being?
Yes.
Interesting.
Mary.
Mary's parents were not without sin, were they?
We're talking about, okay, it's just a category error. We're talking about nature.
Well-
they didn't have a different nature.
Any other questions? House recognized the gentleman from Dallas Fort
They
Worth.
aren't allowed to ask questions.
So you mentioned something like, for example, earlier you had mentioned that there was this idea that
I guess.
you can believe that things, the soul isn't necessarily evolved or whatever, and that, oh, this is what you most certainly said. Evolution doesn't depend on survival of the fittest. I want to see how you can contend with this, necessarily speaking, when all evolutionary claims start with the idea that greater beings have to compete with one another for resources, and then later, how do you contend with that?
Certainly, it definitely has to do with seeing things not necessarily from a Darwinian perspective, and that evolution is not completely based upon Darwin's theory. For instance, the aspects of a community, like a community in which is able to be more sociable, more empathetic, is one that's more likely to survive than one who is not empathetic and not virtuous.
This is a follow-up question?
Yeah.
Yes.
So would you call this genetic drifting then? Is that the technical term of that? Genetic drift?
I would say any form of natural selection would be genetic drift, so you would have to be more specific.
Thank you.
Any other question? The House recognizes the High Chairman.
I have a question. How would you reconcile some of your points with your belief in microevolution?
Yeah, okay. Well, microevolution is most certainly observable, but we're talking about macroevolution where species are created entirely new systems from another being that never possessed those systems altogether.
So I would have a question about, there's a bacteria shown in the study that developed from the ability, normally it consumed organic dead matter, and then it developed the ability after sufficient exposure to nylon rope to consume nylon.
It's consuming the starches found in nylon,
Yeah.
but it's not consuming all of nylon. And starches are
Yeah, but it's going
organic
from
materials.
consuming inanimate to animate.
No, it's consuming
the
starches found in nylon, and starches found in nylon are organic, they're not inorganic.
Okay.
So it's consuming organic pieces. And firstly, it didn't create a whole new system. For example, a being that didn't have a heart cannot then produce a being with a heart. That doesn't happen. It's never happened in evolution ever.
What would your opinion be on the rapid mutation of diseases?
Or you can actually look at the rapid mutation of diseases and they never necessarily improve. In fact, what we see within these mutations is that the mutations actually get weaker. What happens is the reason they're able to thrive in an environment, this is true, the reason they're able to thrive in an environment is mainly because they simply are able to defend off of one specific detail within the environment. For example, there are bacteria that can defend itself against specific stomach environments, but that's only because the mutation that they developed happened to have that defense, but that wasn't something that was planned. It wasn't like, oh, we're going to breed with things that can defend in stomach acid. It was merely accidental. And every mutation, if you look back in all evolutionary generations, every mutation seen has been a detriment to the species, not an improvement to the species ever. Yeah.
So then what about, sorry,
Go ahead.
for the example of the nylon rope bacteria, then would you say that was a detriment to the species to be able to consume inorganic matter?
Well, they're a minority of the species, and they don't segment with nylon. I mean, what makes something a detriment is when you look at the genetic code and the genetic sequence within DNA. For example, what makes it a good DNA code is we can actually look at our mitochondria, for example. We can go and trace it all the way back to sort of like they called it the mitochondrial E, right? And when you look at the mitochondria within the DNA, what changes in the DNA sequences is actually usually bad for the species as a whole. It's never, ever good.
The House recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey to ask a question.
Oh, I think my question's more of a comment.
Save it for the comment section.
Yeah.
Gentleman from...
New Jersey.
Gentleman, what part of New Jersey?
Or New Jersey.
Or New Jersey. How's the floor?
Wow.
Who are you asking?
But I've never heard of it.
Oh, which side are you asking?
I'm asking pro-evolution.
All right. They're over there.
You are? Okay.
I'm from Essex.
Oh,
Essex County, but
Somerset. But no, so for those who are pro-evolution, I'd just be interested, perhaps this was already asked, but it seems to be a common trend that genetic mutations are not positive, usually result in the death of the species as well. I'm just curious to as to how we get to an understanding where there are positive mutation as well as the introduction of different genetic material that is substantial enough to provide us with a new species. Yeah.
The House recognizes the gentleman from Southern California.
Actually, that's a really good point because evolution is not necessarily based off of like creating new things from thin air. That's not logically possible. How evolution actually works is that most organisms are composed of DNA that is dormant. So like in a human being, for instance, 99.98% of their DNA is just raw material that serves no purpose. Evolution is when that DNA is organized according to, evolution occurs when that DNA is organized in different ways in the process of conception. And I would agree that yes, there are definitely negative mutations, but the vast majority of mutations just don't do anything, which is what the main like qualificator for why things like change over time is overall positive, because things that aren't positive, they just die out.
So then that would beg another objection as to how, so let's say, like the argument, I guess atheist, you're not giving an atheist, standpoint, obviously, but the question that begs is, how do you have what is the origin? And like let's say you have like a great wealth of like genetic diversity that's dormant within somebody. Like how does it make sense theologically that God processes that over a length of time rather than just rather than just creating man as man?
Based.
I think actually this is really cool. I think this is an example of God glorifying himself through over time. And that it's more glorious for God to create something over billions of years just for the purpose of glorifying his sons and daughters in the human race than really just pop things into existence genetically speaking. And because of that fact, I would say that the processes by which God created man equally are known to someone who believes in evolution and does not believe in evolution. But the question is just the material means in which he used, whether he just created people instantly or whether he used pre-existing material things that he had already created.
And then, additionally, I'm going to add just one last objection. Our understanding of the Bible in real, our understanding of the Bible, like in a very real sense, there's a great number of genres that contribute to what the Bible is, right? But in the context of creation, we're told that there's like a specific man and a specific woman that
Deep.
are like ordained by God. They are called individuals. And considering the rest of the biblical narrative, I don't think it's very likely that these, like the characters of Adam and Eve, are typological. I think that they probably are real people that existed, and the creation narrative said that God created them. So how do you reconcile there was just thousands of years of evolution, and in reality there was probably 7,000 different species of animals that almost looked like Adam and Eve, and then we got to a certain point where God endowed them with wisdom. I have a hard time reconciling the two ideas.
You make a really good
Stan?
point. You make a really good point, but what I would add to that is that the scripture is interpreted differently according to which section of scripture you're talking about. Like for instance, some sections of scripture are just poetry, some sections of scripture, like the book of Job, are not supposed to be taken historically, either in the context of that narrative, others are taken to be tales of morality, if that makes sense. But Genesis itself is originally designed as a history of the moral life.
Did you not hear him say it's part of?
In that, for instance, there's other complications that come from if Genesis is considered purely a historical fact. For instance, if you consider
I think that's
why humanity
Order.
Okay, but he's saying that I'm violating.
grow over time if humanity came from just two parents? How would that be possible? Wouldn't they be inbred? Or how would they have to marry each other? Like, sort of weird questions like that. So I think that to consider Genesis purely historically is doing a disservice to how its history of the moral aspect of
The narrative of Genesis doesn't, and I said that before it was going to be my last point, but I'm going to say this. The narrative of Genesis doesn't. So, as for comments concerning the debate, the big hole, I think, in evolution comes when you have an objection towards the literal meaning of biblical interpretation, right? I think that's like a serious problem that's not dealt with, because when you look at the Bible, like, yes, there are, like, you know, perhaps you could see like some holes if I say like, oh, well, evolution doesn't exist, therefore, like, where are all the other people? It never says that God didn't create other people, like explicitly create other people with Adam and Eve. But we are given two people named Adam and Eve
1 minute.
in a literal narrative, right? Whereas that's totally different in like the book of Judith. Judith is a fictional character that's like there to prove the point. But everybody else in Genesis is seemingly a real person. So why aren't Adam and Eve? It doesn't make any sense. And if you look at like the literal Hebrew, I'm a Catholic studies major at St. Joe's. I've done like a good amount of study, and it seems that as if it is a real narrative of things that actually happen. So I just don't know if you can reconcile the two ideas. Yeah, that's all.
Comments of up to 2 minutes. And the House recognizes the gentleman from the Jew from Jersey.
This big one talking about basketball. Okay, so the fact, evolution over time. I think I kind of got the feeling by Reben's arguments that he was saying about the whole new systems things, that like new systems just showed up in different species over time. That's not how evolution works. No one says it works that way. It's piece by piece by piece by piece. Like you don't have to have a whole heart in the next species. You just have to have a piece of the heart, or like the things that make up your heart just start like drifting together over time. That's not a whole new piece. It's just existing things coming together.
Order.
And it's not insane that there's like a tiny bit of new matter in your child. Like your child can have a tiny bit more blood vessels than you. That wouldn't be insane.
That's not a whole new piece.
Yeah, no, but that'd be like formed together in an organ. That would be like the stuff that forms organs together. It's the same thing. But also the fact that we all know God planned out salvation history over a long period of time.
1 minute.
Okay? So why would God not also plan other things out over a long period of time? It's not impossible that he would do that, and it doesn't diminish his creating ability. We all know God could create things instantly if he wanted. We know he could forgive the human race instantly if he wanted to. Or, not like that, that's heresy. But we all know he could like snap all our spines if he wanted to. You know? But God creates out of love, and it's out of love for us to trust his process of developing evolution, just like the development of doctrine or the development of other stuff. So.
Time. Speakers. The House recognizes the gentleman from Linden?
Yeah.
Where's that?
Washington.
From Linden, Washington. Your 2 minutes starts now.
I just wanted to try to clear up some of the things said about gene transfer and evolution being strictly negative. So if we observe bacteria, we can see that they have two methods of gene transfer. That is vertical, as in like directly passing down to your offspring, or horizontal, which is actually picking up genes or DNA that is not a part of their actual genome when they were created from their original offspring or parents. Yeah. So we see this clearly in history. I've done this in science class. You can add DNA material to a bacteria, and it's a natural process where that bacteria takes up that DNA and now has a entirely new capabilities. Like we can make bacteria that can glow.
Blasphemy.
Can glow green when they are, next to certain chemicals. So like
1 minute.
There's this whole method of picking up positively genetic material that would explain a lot of these problems that the anti-evolutionists have with evolution. Additionally, there are many bacterias that, and this is one of the largest problems in modern medicine today, that have evolved this antibiotic resistance. So our antibiotics no longer kill these bacteria because they have picked up, through horizontal gene transfer and vertical gene transfer as well, through evolution, they've picked up these abilities to no longer be killed by our antibiotics. So this is a massive problem with. This is a great example of this happening in real life.
The House recognizes the gentleman from the suburbs of Chicago.
I guess first I'll start more naturally, philosophically. I think one category error we're making is assuming that species and beings are basically merely just what they can do and what their genes are. Whereas on the other hand, as if we hold to the perennial philosophy, we understand that things have substances, things are essences, things have forms. And so merely, one thing cannot become another thing merely through, natural processes. Forms are immaterial, although they inform matter, obviously. And this also points to the absurdity, I think the absurdity of saying that one form of thing or type of thing can create another type and form of thing. This, first of all, you can't give what you don't have, metaphysically. Sure. If you don't have something, you can't give it to someone else. And also, a more perfect thing cannot come from a lesser thing. Now, of course, one might object, the theistic
1 minute.
might object, well, yes, but this is, God somehow does this, but then we're talking about miracles. We're not talking about science, we're talking about miraculous things that... Okay, well then, if we're talking about miraculous things, then we're in the domain of theology, not just hard science.
Don't you think it's
Out of order, gentlemen.
So basically, just think about, all things reproduce according to their kind. It's sort of it's just a monstrosity to think that something would give birth to some other kind of thing. It's just untenable. Now going more into the theological aspect, I find it hard to believe that, centuries, generations of church fathers, church doctors, theologians, faithful, would have one conception of man's origin and how we interpret divine revelation, specifically the beginning of Genesis. And then, in the last 200 years, non-Catholics would somehow teach us, new things, and we have a almost not diametrically, but almost just this novum, this novel interpretation. I think if we can't find this interpretation of the scriptures anywhere in the fathers, anywhere in the doctors of the church, then I don't think it's really something that we should be holding. And I really wonder why we feel the need to interpret divine revelation in light of science, in light of scientific theories and things that are, extrapolated from observations, as opposed to the opposite, when we know that the highest science is theology. How much time is left?
Well, I stopped because I like you what you're saying.
Oh.
So basically, you're out of order.
Basically,
I am order.
In scriptural interpretation, tradition, in the interpretation of man's origin, which is a matter of divine revelation, because like people point out, none of us were there. This was something that needed to be revealed to us. And in the manner of divine revelation, our rule is not, what we can finagle to fit the latest scientific theory. It is what has been perennially held in
10 seconds.
churches, fathers, and doctors throughout time. And so I think we should reject evolution both on philosophical grounds and on the grounds of the rule of faith and the interpretation of divine revelation in the church.
As recognized as the gentleman from Cleveland.
And
and people are talking too long, so I'm just going to talk for 10 seconds. One glaring issue I find is if the
5 seconds.
evolutionary processes are explained as you are saying, then I do not understand where the rest of the humans went besides Adam and Eve if they are the progenitors of the human race.
Time. The House recognizes the High Chairman from Northern Virginia.
Okay. Something to my point, something to their point that I would say, but also to your point. I don't entirely 100% agree with evolution. But
Please.
I can see it as a highly and definitely possible. So my basis for this is that now I'm not a studied biologist like you were in college, but my evidence for this is that the whole world is intelligible. The universe is intelligible. Like, we look back at space and time, the cosmos, and we can see the order of the planets and the stars, and we can predict it with the numbers that we've scrolled on a sheet of paper. Because God gave us rationality. God lets us see the world like the way He ordered it, because He is rational. He is logical. He makes sense, right? Like, I mean, the Big Bang, right? Discovered by Catholic scientist Father George Lamantra.
Jesuit. 1 minute.
And then and like there were many other Catholic scientists. There was a Catholic priest who discovered like archaeology. But I mean, this is not archaeology. Discovered fossils.
The Frock.
It was all this science, and like science is just merely the study, the rational creation of God. Like it's ordered towards the salvation and love and truth. That's what the beauty is telling us. That's what the truth of science is telling us. And like, why should not life also be ordered in such a way? Like God doesn't like at every moment really like create Mars with slightly different precision in the sky, right? God doesn't at every moment like create a new cloud. Like He allows those to arise through natural processes. Like, and another thing that this side said is that like if evolution happens, nothing's special. It doesn't matter. I think that's wrong. Because I think that evolution, in order for for all of this
Time.
for life,
The House Speaker gives the High Chairman an additional minute.
Yes, thank you. In order for like the world and all this to happen in the exact perfect way that it did, like the odds are so unfathomably low. It would take nothing short of divine intervention for any of this to work out. Like even for you to have a single cell bacteria is like impossible, right? And so that means that, like, if evolution is true, I would say it is a miracle that it even produced anything like this. And, like, every new species, to your point, you say it required a miracle, right? Doesn't it make sense that God can work miracles through His perfect, beautiful, and logical creation?
Not science.
Well, what I'm saying is that science is a miracle, isn't it? The intelligibility of the universe is a miracle because we can, like, look at the rational world, write down some numbers, and it describes it, right? And the reason that is because it was created by a rational being, an eternal lawgiver, who doesn't just make up rules for fun. Like, He makes these rules because they're beautiful and they're true and they're meant to point us towards our ultimate end.
Any further comments? Going once, going twice.